Why avoidant exes come back when you ignore them? How many of you have ever had someone pull away from you, disappear like a ghost, and then when you finally stop chasing, they come back? Why does this happen? Why do avoidant exes suddenly wake up when you go silent? It's not magic, it's human psychology, and today I'm going to break it down for you so you can take back your power. See, avoidant people fear closeness. They crave connection, but they also fear being trapped. So when you pursue them, their walls go up. They feel pressured, overwhelmed, and they run. But the second you step back, something flips inside them. Suddenly the pressure is gone, and what happens? Their fear of being suffocated is replaced by a new fear, the fear of losing you. The very thing they thought they wanted, space, now feels like emptiness. You see, human beings are wired to want what they can't have. When you stop reaching, you change the dynamic. You go from being the pursuer to the one who is being pursued. And that shift, that's when they start to wonder, wait, did I make a mistake? Did I lose something valuable? Avoidant individuals experience a deep internal conflict when it comes to relationships. On one hand, they crave intimacy like everyone else. They desire love, connection, and companionship, but at the same time, they have a profound fear of losing their independence. This internal tug-of-war often stems from childhood experiences, past heartbreaks, or deeply ingrained beliefs about attachment. As a result, they subconsciously push people away the moment they start feeling too close or vulnerable. It's not because they don't care, it's because their nervous system is wired to protect them from perceived emotional suffocation. When someone with avoidant tendencies enters a romantic relationship, they often enjoy the initial phase of attraction and connection. However, as emotional intimacy deepens, their fear response is triggered. They might start feeling overwhelmed, anxious, or even resentful, not necessarily because their partner has done anything wrong, but because closeness feels like a loss of personal autonomy. This is when they begin to withdraw. They might become distant, less communicative, or make excuses to spend time alone. For the person on the receiving end, this behavior can be incredibly confusing. One day, the avoidant partner seems deeply invested, affectionate, and engaged, and the next they are cold, indifferent, or even completely unresponsive. This hot and cold behavior often leaves their partner feeling insecure, questioning what went wrong, and ultimately chasing after the avoidant in an attempt to restore the connection. But this is exactly where the cycle begins. The more the anxious or secure partner pursues, the more the avoidant partner feels trapped. The attention, reassurance, and affection that once felt good now feel suffocating. At this point, their natural instinct is to pull away even further, creating an emotional gap that continues to widen. The avoidant may convince themselves that they need to escape the relationship, that they are better off alone, or that their partner is demanding too much from them. In reality, it's not the partner that is the problem. It's their deep-seated fear of being consumed by emotional intimacy. But here's where things get interesting. The moment the partner stops chasing, everything changes. When they finally stop calling, texting, and seeking validation, the avoidant person experiences an entirely different type of fear, the fear of loss. The relief they initially felt from escaping the relationship is quickly replaced by anxiety. Instead of feeling like they are regaining control, they start wondering if they made a mistake. This shift happens because the dynamic has changed. When someone is always available, the avoidant feels overwhelmed. But when that person suddenly disappears, the avoidant is forced to confront their own emotions. Without external pressure, they start reflecting on what they truly want. Instead of feeling trapped, they begin to feel abandoned. They start missing the good moments, the laughter, the connection they once tried to escape. The same emotional defense mechanisms that made them pull away now make them reconsider their decision. Avoidants struggle with emotional regulation. When someone is actively pursuing them, they feel a sense of control because they know they are wanted. But when that same person stops reaching out, they experience a new kind of discomfort, uncertainty. Human beings are wired to fear uncertainty more than anything else. And when the person they pushed away no longer seems interested, their mind starts filling in the gaps. What if they've moved on? What if I lost something valuable? What if I was wrong? These questions create emotional tension, which often leads avoidants to come back. But here's the key. They are not necessarily returning because they've overcome their fears or changed their attachment style. More often than not, they are returning because they now feel the need to regain the security they unknowingly lost. This is why it's so important not to fall into the cycle of chasing an avoidant partner. The moment you start pursuing again, they are likely to retreat once more. It's not manipulation, it's simply how their attachment system works. To truly break free from this pattern, the focus should always be on self-worth, confidence, and emotional independence, instead of waiting for an avoidant ex to come back. The real power comes from realizing that relationships should never be based on someone's fear of loss, but rather on mutual desire, effort, and emotional availability. When you pull back and create space, something shifts in the psychological dynamic of an avoidant ex. Human beings are wired to want what they feel they can't have. This isn't just about about relationships, it's a fundamental principle of human nature. The more something seems scarce or unattainable, the more valuable it becomes in the eyes of the one who desires it. In relationships, this effect is especially pronounced with individuals who have avoidant attachment tendencies. Avoidants typically push people away when they feel overwhelmed by closeness, but this distancing behavior doesn't mean they don't care. It's a defense mechanism designed to protect them from the vulnerability that comes with deep emotional connection. However, when the person they once distanced themselves from suddenly stops reaching out, they experience a completely different emotional response. At first, an avoidant ex may feel relieved when the person they left stops chasing them. They convince themselves that space is what they needed, that they are finally free from the pressure of emotional demands. But that relief is temporary. Over time, something unexpected happens. They begin to feel uneasy. They start questioning their decision. Their mind, which initially justified the need for distance, now starts filling in the gaps with uncertainty. Avoidance may not immediately recognize this shift. Instead, it begins as a subtle awareness, an unconscious realization that something is missing. When someone who used to be emotionally invested suddenly stops calling, texting, or showing any indication of longing, it disrupts the avoidance internal narrative. They were prepared for pursuit. They expected resistance, but instead they are met with silence. That silence creates a void that their mind can't help but focus on. The moment someone stops chasing, they stop being predictable. Predictability brings comfort, even for an avoidant person. When an ex consistently reaches out, begs for another chance, or tries to rationalize the breakup, the avoidant knows exactly where they stand. They remain in control. But when that pattern is broken, the avoidant is thrown into a state of uncertainty. Uncertainty is one of the most uncomfortable emotions a human can experience. We crave clarity, even when we are the ones who created the distance. When an ex stops chasing, the avoidant suddenly loses that certainty. Instead of feeling pursued, they now feel a sense of loss that they weren't expecting. They start wondering, did I misjudge the situation? Why aren't they trying to get me back? Are they moving on with someone else? The very absence of pursuit makes the avoidant reconsider their previous assumptions. What once felt overwhelming now feels like something they might have taken for granted. They begin to remember the good moments, the emotional connection, and the stability that was once present. Because human memory is selective, they may even idealize the relationship, focusing on what they miss rather than what made them leave in the first place. As this emotional shift continues, the fear of suffocation that once made them pull away is replaced by the fear of losing something valuable. That fear of loss is powerful because it triggers the scarcity effect, the psychological phenomenon where people place a higher value on things they believe they can no longer have. This is why stepping back and focusing on yourself is so important. Not only does it disrupt the avoidance pattern of retreating when pursued, but it also shifts the dynamic in your favor. Instead of playing the role of the pursuer, you become the person who is being pursued. Your absence creates a presence in their mind. Your silence forces them to acknowledge the possibility that they may have lost you for good. However, the key to this strategy is authenticity. The purpose of stepping back should never be to manipulate or test an avoidant ex. It should be a genuine decision to reclaim your self-worth, focus on your own growth, and detach from an unhealthy dynamic. When this is done authentically, it naturally shifts the balance of power. You become someone who is no longer available on their terms, and that in itself makes you more desirable. Ultimately, when you stop chasing, you allow the other person to truly feel the impact of their decision. They either realize what they lost and take meaningful action to come back, or they fade away entirely, showing you that they were never truly committed in the first place. Either way, you win because you are no longer investing your energy into someone who only values you when you're slipping away. When you withdraw your attention from an avoidant ex, something powerful happens. They are forced to confront their emotions rather than suppress them. Avoidant individuals have a tendency to detach and disconnect when things become emotionally intense. It's their way of protecting themselves from vulnerability, often without realizing it. When they leave a relationship, they convince themselves that it's the right decision, focusing on the relief of escaping emotional entanglement. However, this is only half of the picture. What they don't anticipate is the emotional shift that happens when the person they left suddenly stops chasing. At first, they might feel a sense of relief, as if a weight has been lifted off their shoulders. They tell themselves they needed space, that things were becoming too much, and that moving on is the best course of action. But this relief is often short-lived. Human beings are creatures of habit, and the presence of someone in their life, especially someone who cared deeply for them, leaves an imprint. That imprint doesn't just disappear overnight. When an ex is still reaching out, asking for answers, or trying to rekindle the connection, the avoidant can continue suppressing their feelings. They maintain the upper hand by reinforcing their belief that leaving was the right choice. However, when that expected pursuit stops, their emotional suppression begins to break down. They suddenly don't have the external validation that confirms they are still wanted. The absence of contact creates space for feelings they weren't ready to process. Instead of being constantly reminded that their ex is still interested, they are met with silence. And silence is powerful. In that silence, the avoidant ex starts to think. They begin to remember the relationship differently. At first, they may try to rationalize the breakup again, reminding themselves why they left. But something feels different. There's no longer an emotional buffer of reassurance from their ex's messages or calls. Instead, they are left alone with their thoughts. And in this space, their subconscious mind starts to replay the good moments, the laughter, the connection, the support, all the things they had once minimized in order to justify their need for distance. Emotions don't simply vanish, they are often just buried. The avoidant ex, who once felt certain about their decision, now experiences emotional discomfort. The silence you provide forces them to tap into emotions they previously suppressed. They start wondering if they made a mistake. They ask themselves questions they never considered when they were being pursued. What if I acted too quickly? Why aren't they reaching out? Are they moving on? Was I wrong about them? This uncertainty triggers an emotional response they weren't prepared for. While they thought they wanted space, they now feel something new, doubt. And doubt is an uncomfortable place to be. Avoidant individuals are used to controlling their emotional environment by creating distance, but when the other person stops reaching out, they no longer have control over the narrative. They can't tell themselves they'll always be there because now they're not so sure. Another important factor at play here is the contrast effect. When someone has been a consistent presence in your life, it's easy to take them for granted, but when that presence is suddenly gone, it creates a stark contrast. The avoidant, who once saw the relationship as overwhelming, now starts to feel the void left behind. That void is what makes them start thinking differently. Instead of feeling suffocated, they feel a lack. Instead of feeling pressured, they feel uncertainty. This emotional shift often leads them to test the waters. It's why avoidant exes tend to reach out after periods of silence, often in subtle ways, a random text, a social media like, or an indirect comment. It's their way of gauging whether the connection is still there. But the truth is, they wouldn't be doing this if they weren't feeling something. Their emotions, once suppressed, are now at the surface. But here's the key. Just because they come back doesn't mean they've changed. It simply means they are now feeling what they had previously ignored. And that's why your response matters. If you immediately jump back into their world, they might fall back into old patterns. If instead you continue focusing on yourself and maintaining the distance, you allow them to sit with their emotions longer. You give them space to truly process their feelings rather than retreating into avoidance again. By stepping back, you force them to acknowledge what they tried so hard to suppress. You shift the power dynamic in a way that makes them confront their true emotions instead of running from them. And in doing so, you gain clarity because if they truly care, they will step up. If they don't, you know their return was only temporary. Either way, you win because now the decision is on your terms, not theirs. Avoidant individuals often appear detached, independent, and emotionally distant, but that doesn't mean they don't feel deeply. In fact, many avoidants experience emotions just as intensely, if not more so, than others. The difference is that they have learned to suppress, ignore, or rationalize their emotions rather than express them. This pattern often stems from past experiences where vulnerability led to disappointment, rejection, or even emotional neglect. Over time, they develop a self-protective mechanism. It convinces them that relying on others emotionally is dangerous or suffocating. When an avoidant person ends a relationship, they may appear cold, unaffected, or even relieved. They tell themselves that distance is what they need, that the relationship was becoming overwhelming, or that they were losing their sense of self. This outward detachment can make their ex feel as though the avoidant never cared in the first place. But this assumption is misleading. Avoidants don't necessarily move on quickly. They just bury their emotions beneath logic and distraction. Their ability to suppress emotions is strongest when they believe their ex is still emotionally invested in them. If their ex is reaching out, sending messages, or showing signs of wanting to reconcile, it confirms their belief that they still have control over the situation. This allows them to continue avoiding emotional discomfort. They can tell themselves, I could go back if I wanted to. They're still there. This mental safety net prevents them from fully processing the loss of the relationship. However, when the ex stops reaching out, something shifts. The avoidant no longer has the emotional reassurance that their ex is still waiting for them. The sense of control they once had begins to slip away. And without that security, their suppressed emotions start rising to the surface. At first, they may rationalize it as simple curiosity. They might wonder why their ex suddenly stopped trying, or assume they're just taking a break from reaching out. But as more time passes, this curiosity turns into something deeper, discomfort. Avoidants are not immune to emotional attachment. They may suppress their feelings, but they can't erase them. The absence of their ex creates an emotional void that they weren't expecting. The brain naturally remembers experiences through contrast. When the relationship was active, the avoidant may have felt overwhelmed by closeness, but when that closeness is gone, their brain starts remembering the warmth, connection, and companionship they once had. The same distance they thought they wanted now feels unfamiliar. This contrast triggers a psychological shift. What once felt like suffocation now feels like loss. The space they created begins to feel like emptiness rather than freedom. And because avoidants process emotions differently, they often take longer to realize what they are feeling. While their ex may have processed the breakup immediately, the avoidant is just beginning to experience the emotional weight of it weeks or even months later. One of the strongest forces driving human behavior is uncertainty. When the avoidant knew their ex was still emotionally attached, they didn't have to face the possibility of permanent loss. But when that certainty disappears, it creates a sense of urgency. They begin questioning whether they made the right choice. The fear of losing someone permanently activates their attachment system, forcing them to reevaluate their decision. This is why many avoidant exes suddenly return after weeks or months of no contact. Their brain has cycled through the initial relief phase and entered the stage of realization. Instead of feeling free, they feel a growing sense of unease. They might not even fully understand why they feel this way, but their subconscious is pushing them to reestablish the connection. This is when they might send a random message, react to a social media post, or find an excuse to reach out. It's their way of testing whether the door is still open. But here's the crucial part. Their return is not necessarily a sign of deep transformation. It doesn't mean they have worked through their avoidant tendencies or are suddenly ready for a committed relationship. More often than not, they are responding to the discomfort of uncertainty and loss. If their ex immediately welcomes them back, they may fall into old patterns, reassured that they still have control. However, if their ex maintains their distance, the avoidant is forced to sit with their emotions even longer, which can lead to deeper self-reflection. This is why pulling away is such a powerful move. It interrupts the avoidant cycle of suppression and forces them to acknowledge feelings they would rather ignore. It removes their emotional safety net and makes them experience the impact of their choices. And ultimately, it reveals the truth, whether they genuinely want to reconnect for the right reasons or whether they are simply reacting to temporary discomfort. Either way, it shifts the power dynamic, ensuring that any future connection happens on equal terms rather than in a one-sided pursuit. When you stop chasing an avoidant ex, they are forced to face the reality of your absence. Avoidant individuals often struggle with emotional intimacy because it makes them feel vulnerable, which triggers their deep-seated fears of losing independence or being emotionally overwhelmed. When they feel this way, their instinct is to pull away, creating distance to regain their sense of control. This behavior can be frustrating for their partners, who often respond by seeking reassurance, asking for explanations, or trying to fix the situation. However, the more they chase, the more the avoidant feels the need to withdraw further. But something interesting happens when you stop pursuing. The avoidant person who initially felt relieved by the breakup or distance now begins to experience an entirely different emotion, uncertainty. This is a powerful shift. While they may have pushed you away to create emotional space, they never expected you to completely disappear from their world. They assumed you would always be there, lingering in the background, waiting for them to come back when they were ready. When that expectation is shattered, the avoidant suddenly loses their sense of control. They are no longer dictating the terms of engagement. Instead of feeling like the one who made the decision to step away, they now feel like they are the ones being left behind. This realization is uncomfortable for them because it forces them to confront something they've been avoiding, the possibility of permanent loss. Avoidants are used to regulating their emotions by creating distance, but when you remove yourself entirely, they no longer have that buffer. They can't rely on your presence for validation or reassurance, even indirectly. They don't have the comfort of knowing that if they ever decide to come back, you will still be waiting for them. This uncertainty disrupts their emotional defenses, and for the first time, they start questioning their actions. At first, they may try to convince themselves that they don't care. They might focus on distractions, bury themselves in work, or convince themselves that they are better off alone. But deep down, the human mind does not respond well to uncertainty. The more they realize they don't know what's going on in your life, the more their thoughts start to center around you. What are you doing? Have you moved on? Are you happier without them? These questions create a mental loop that keeps them engaged even if they don't actively reach out. One of the most powerful psychological forces at play here is the loss aversion principle. Studies show that people feel the pain of losing something far more intensely than the pleasure of gaining something new. When you were actively chasing them, they didn't feel like they were losing anything. They still had emotional security, knowing that you were available to them in some way. But when you withdraw completely, they start experiencing the discomfort of true loss. This discomfort often leads to an emotional reevaluation. The avoidant starts to remember the good times rather than the moments of emotional intensity that made them pull away. They reflect on what they miss instead of what made them feel overwhelmed. The relationship, which once felt like a source of pressure, now begins to feel like something valuable that they may have taken for granted. As this realization grows, they may feel the urge to reestablish contact. It often starts subtly, a text that seems casual, a like on social media, or an indirect inquiry about how you're doing. These small actions are their way of testing the waters, trying to gauge if the door is still open without making themselves vulnerable. But here's where many people make a mistake. They see this initial reach out as a sign that the avoidant has changed or is now ready for deep emotional commitment. In reality, it's often just their way of relieving the emotional discomfort they are feeling. If you immediately respond with the same level of eagerness as before, they might revert back to their avoidant tendencies, knowing that they can still pull away and return on their own terms. This is why maintaining your emotional independence is key. The moment you stop chasing, you shift the power dynamic. You are no longer someone who is waiting, you are someone who has moved forward. This forces the avoidant to step up in a meaningful way if they truly want to reconnect. And if they don't, then their return was never about genuine emotional growth in the first place. By removing yourself from the equation, you allow them to experience the full weight of what they lost. And that, more than anything else, is what makes them rethink their choices. Whether they act on those realizations is up to them, but by stepping back, you give yourself the clarity and power to decide whether they truly deserve another chance. When you stop chasing an avoidant ex, you disrupt the cycle that allows them to feel in control. Avoidant individuals tend to feel safest when they believe they have control over emotional closeness. They create distance because they associate intimacy with a loss of autonomy. And when they pull away, they expect their partner to react in a predictable way, by seeking reassurance, trying to talk things through, or attempting to close the gap they created. But when that reaction doesn't happen, when you don't fight for them, don't text, don't ask for explanations, and instead disappear from their world, something fundamental shifts in their mind. The dynamic that once gave them power now leaves them in an unfamiliar position. Instead of feeling like they are the ones making decisions, they are suddenly faced with a reality they didn't expect. You're gone. And not just in a temporary attention-seeking way. You're truly absent, no longer lingering as an emotional option for them. Avoidants are used to relying on their ability to suppress emotions. They convince themselves that they don't need deep emotional bonds, that they are better off alone, and that emotional independence is the key to their happiness. But all of this is a learned defense mechanism, not an absolute truth. Underneath their avoidance is still the same human need for connection that everyone experiences. They just bury it deeper, convincing themselves that emotional attachment is a risk they can't afford. However, human psychology doesn't allow us to simply erase emotional connections, no matter how much we suppress them. When someone significant disappears from our lives, the mind begins searching for them. At first, the avoidant may not consciously recognize this process. They might simply feel a vague sense of unease, an unexplained irritation, or even a restless curiosity about what's happening in your life. But as time passes, this curiosity transforms into something stronger, an emotional reaction they can no longer ignore. The moment you stop chasing, they begin to feel what they have avoided feeling, loss. In the past, they were able to distance themselves from you without truly experiencing what life would be like without you, because they always had the safety net of knowing you were still emotionally present. But now that safety net is gone, and the brain, which once suppressed the emotional significance of the relationship, begins to recognize the full weight of your absence. This is where real psychological discomfort sets in for the avoidant. While they initially believed they wanted space, they now start to feel its consequences. They begin to wonder, did I make a mistake? Why aren't they reaching out? Are they moving on? What if they never come back? These thoughts trigger something deep within them, their attachment system, which they have spent so much time trying to suppress. The mind is not like unfinished business, and when a significant emotional connection is suddenly severed without closure, it creates an unresolved tension. They might start dreaming about you, randomly remembering small moments from the relationship, or feeling a sense of longing they can't quite explain. What's happening is that they are now experiencing the very emotions they had been trying to avoid all along. The emotions they suppressed during the relationship, the ones that made them feel overwhelmed, are now resurfacing in a completely different form. Instead of feeling suffocated, they now feel abandoned. Instead of feeling the need to escape, they now feel the desire to reconnect. This shift is why many avoidant exes come back after a long period of no contact. It's not necessarily because they have changed or are suddenly ready for deep commitment. It's because they are reacting chasing to the discomfort of losing something they once took for granted. But here's where the true power lies. The way you handle their return determines whether this cycle repeats or breaks. If you immediately welcome them back, they may feel momentary relief, but then quickly fall back into their old patterns. They regain a sense of control, and the cycle begins again. But if you remain distant, if you continue focusing on yourself rather than them, they are forced to sit with their emotions for longer. They must confront what they are feeling instead of running from it. The only way for an avoidant to truly change their patterns is for them to face their emotions rather than suppress them. And the only way they can do that is if they experience the full reality of losing someone who mattered to them. By not chasing, you give them the space to process what they have avoided for so long. And in that space, they either come to terms with their emotions and make a real effort to reconnect, or they fade away, revealing that their return was never about genuine emotional connection in the first place. Either way, you win. Because in choosing not to chase, you reclaim your power, you shift the focus from them to yourself. And most importantly, you create the conditions for a relationship that is based on true emotional reciprocity rather than one-sided pursuit. The moment you stop chasing an avoidant ex, you reclaim your power. This power is not about control over them. It's about control over yourself, your emotions, and your own sense of self-worth. In relationships, especially those with an avoidant partner, there is often an unspoken dynamic where one person does the emotional heavy lifting while the other pulls away. The more one person pursues, the more the avoidant retreats, creating a cycle of imbalance that leaves the pursuer feeling anxious, rejected, and emotionally depleted. But when you stop chasing, everything changes. You disrupt the cycle, forcing a shift in both your ex and yourself. Instead of focusing all your energy on getting them to come back, you redirect that energy inward. At first, this can feel uncomfortable, even painful, because it requires you to face your own emotions without the distraction of trying to fix the relationship. However, this discomfort is also the catalyst for transformation. It is in this space where you stop looking outward for validation and instead turn inward for strength that you rediscover your sense of self. Avoidant individuals often maintain emotional control in relationships by keeping their partners on an emotional leash. They may not fully invest in the relationship, but they give just enough to keep their partner engaged, ensuring that they remain an option while avoiding deep emotional vulnerability. This creates a situation where the anxious partner constantly seeks reassurance while the avoidant holds all the cards. But the moment you step back, that dynamic no longer serves them. They are no longer in control, and suddenly they are the ones who feel the uncertainty they once projected onto you. This shift is powerful because avoidants are not immune to attachment. They just process it differently. When they believe they have emotional security, they can remain detached. But when that security is taken away, they are forced to confront feelings they have suppressed. Without your energy fueling the connection, they begin to feel the loss in ways they didn't anticipate. They may have expected relief, but instead, they experience a growing void. They start to wonder why you aren't reaching out, why you aren't still trying, and whether they truly made the right decision. However, this isn't just about them, it's about you. When you stop chasing, you take back the energy you were once pouring into them and invest it in yourself. You begin to heal, to focus on your own growth, and to rebuild your life in a way that no longer revolves around their presence or absence. This is where real empowerment happens. You stop seeing their validation as the measure of your worth and start realizing that your value was never dependent on their acknowledgement in the first place. As you detach emotionally, you begin to see things more clearly. You recognize patterns that you may have ignored before, times when they were inconsistent, times when you felt unheard, times when you settled for less than you deserved. The space that once felt empty now becomes filled with self-awareness, and in that awareness you gain clarity. You begin to understand that love should not be about chasing someone who cannot meet you where you are. It should be about mutual effort, emotional safety, and genuine reciprocity. At the same time, the avoidant ex is experiencing a different kind of realization. The control they once had is gone, and with it, their ability to suppress emotions with the comfort of knowing you were still there. The absence of your energy forces them to confront their own feelings, and as time passes, they may start to experience regret. They may try to re-enter your life in subtle ways, a text, a reaction to your social media, a casual check-in disguised as small talk, but now the dynamic has shifted. The question is no longer whether they will come back, but whether you even want them to. By the time they return, you have already started to heal. You are no longer waiting for them to validate your worth. You are no longer desperate for their attention. You have built a version of yourself that is stronger, more self-assured, and no longer willing to settle for emotional breadcrumbs. And in that moment, you realize the greatest power you ever had was never about getting them to come back. It was about knowing you never needed them to. This is the ultimate shift. It is no longer about the avoidant, their actions, or whether they return. It is about you, your growth, and your ability to stand firm in your own worth. And when you reach this point, you have already won. Because the greatest freedom is realizing that you are always enough without them, without their validation, without the chase. And in that realization, you find the strength to choose what truly serves you rather than waiting for someone who was never fully present in the first place. At the end of the day, this entire journey isn't about an avoidant ex. It's about you. It's about reclaiming your energy, your confidence, and your self-worth. It's about stepping out of the exhausting cycle of chasing love and realizing that love, real love, is never something you have to beg for. The moment you stop seeking validation from someone who is emotionally unavailable, you give yourself permission to heal, to grow, and to become the most powerful version of yourself. And what happens when you do that? Suddenly the dynamic shifts. The person who once pulled away now feels the space you left behind. They start to wonder, they start to feel the loss, and they start to experience the uncertainty that you once carried. But by that point, something incredible happens. You no longer need them to come back. Because by then, you've already realized that your life, your happiness, and your peace were never dependent on them in the first place. You've built something stronger, an unshakable foundation within yourself that no one can take away. And when that happens, whether they return or not no longer matters. What matters is that you have stepped into your power. You have broken free from the cycle. You have chosen yourself. And that is where true freedom lies. Thank you for being here today, for showing up for yourself, and for taking the steps to build a future where you are the priority. Because when you prioritize yourself, everything else falls into place. So keep growing, keep thriving, and never forget you are enough just as you are. Thank you.